It seems like all the focus on religious trauma
You've been listening to the
is
Feather Main
centered
Soul Wisdom
primarily around
podcast,
Christian
hosted by Kit
spaces,
Kilstow.
specifically
Learn more
the
about
evangelical,
Feather Main Soul
exvangelical
at
movement, of which there are many
feathermainsoul.com.
individuals posting,
Kit's
creating
passionate
content
about embodied
it
living
on
and finding
TikTok,
authentic
on
joy by
Facebook,
connecting with
on
yourself
social
and
media,
others.
on YouTube as a whole.
Kit loves working
There
with
have been books written about it.
neurodivergent, chronically
I
ill, or
don't
disabled individuals, as well as anyone
that
who wants to
information
reclaim the stories
has been
and find new
produced
stories
quite
for
as
them.
widely about trauma in other
Music
religions,
is
even
Running with
other
the
major
Horses
world
by
religions.
Purple Planet Music.
But I also haven't
This
been looking for
podcast
it, so
is
I don't
hosted
know
on the
what's
Muse
out there
Charmer
and what
Media
isn't out there.
Network. Find
What I
out
do
more
know is
by
that
visiting the podcast
something
website
that
and following the
many
links to
neurodivergent
Muse Charmer.
people will resonate
Please don't
with,
forget to like,
unfortunately,
subscribe, or
is
follow the
that
podcast
religion, and
at your
especially
favorite
the Christian
podcast listening
homogeny
or social media site.
religions that are baked here into the U.S., that religion can be a very traumatic experience for us. One of the things, for example, that I and other neurodivergent people have talked about is wanting to know why, catching inconsistencies in theological materials, wanting to know the reasons behind things. It's not just enough to know that these are the rules and these are what we're supposed to do, but the reason is why. And when we look at a religion, for example, like Christianity, whose core materials were written down so many centuries ago within a context of a culture that we cannot even begin to get a full picture of, simply because the archaeological material doesn't exist. I'm sure 100, 200 years from now, even 300 years from now, if humanity still exists on Earth or in some form, that if they were to try to create a full cultural picture of, for example, one country or even one region or one state or one city within a country, that they would be unable to replicate a full picture even with all of the materials that are out there on the internet. It's just simply impossible. There's a lot of pitfalls to that. But the truth is that religious trauma is real for autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent individuals. And religious trauma often affects how we look at religion, which also affects our brain patterns, how our brains see the world, how we see the world. So it's all combined. So in this podcast episode, I want to introduce you to a term that I have been working with and thinking about, and that is AutiSpiritual, or the more broad term, neurospiritual. Hi, and welcome to this week's show. I'm very excited to talk about this week's show. I feel like I am finally getting to the heart of not just the way I think about spirituality, but also the way that my communities think about spirituality. And by the time that this episode goes live, I'm going to start doing some longer videos on YouTube. I've done like short 2 or 3 minute kind of pick-me-ups, but I'm feeling comfortable now behind the camera, which is wonderful. I hadn't felt comfortable behind the camera before. And because of that, I'm going to start doing some longer videos where I talk about different things related to my spiritual work at Feather Main Soul. And one of the first series I have planned actually ties right into this podcast. So once that comes out, I'll update the show notes. Likewise, I will put this episode in those show notes. Now, there's a lot of different terms, and I am very much a fan of everybody claiming their own label. So for the most part in this podcast, I'm going to be talking about AutiSpiritual, which is basically the way that I, as an autistic person, think about my spirituality. The broader term for this, neurodivergently spiritual, divergently spiritual, spiritual divergence. There's a lot of different ways you can mix and match those words. Where I'm taking my inspiration from are the terms autigender and genderqueer. Autigender means that I cannot think about or envision my gender identity as being separate from my neurodivergence. In other words, the way that I am neurodivergent, the way it makes my brain work, impacts how I think about my gender, and you can't separate the two. Gender queer is somebody who does not have a fixed gender, who has a fluid gender, who switches along the gender binary, outside of the gender binary. And it's kind of an umbrella term that is under the transgender umbrella. So, we could think about this as, queering spirituality, queering religion, which is something that I'll be talking about in one of those YouTube videos. Actually did some great work on it in a class this semester that really, I think, resonated with my fellow classmates. We had a blast doing our presentations, which is not something you often say about doing presentations in class. So what is AutiSpiritual? What it means is that my spirituality, the way I look at my spirituality, is impacted both by how my brain works as well as by how other people perceive me as a neurodivergent, specifically autism and ADHD, among a few other friends, a person with that neurotype. And again, I don't believe, looking at my life, religion in one way, shape, or form has always been, or spirituality more broadly, has been a part of my life. I have had kind of a push-pull relationship with it. I've experienced religious trauma that has pushed me away from it. I have come back to it and reclaimed it. And really here recently, I have leaned into my spirituality as a way to heal. And I don't, if you've listened to me for any length of time, you know how much I do not like the word heal as in a final destination, but rather in this case, I'm using it as putting the different pieces of myself back together. And I'm really finding a sense of identity and purpose and a sense of wholeness and embodiedness within spirituality. Just a quick recap. I don't want you to think that I'm talking about religion and I am only talking about some sort of organized large-scale religion, whatever flavor that may be or how that may show up for you. I speak about religion as a way to create order out of chaos, to use a more scholarly definition of religion. And there are many of them, and they have been debated for decades, for centuries among all the thinkers in academia. Spirituality more broadly, when you take away all the references to God, because spirituality and religion, neither one has to include God or a divinity, or even only one God or divinity, speaking as a polytheist. But spirituality is just a connection with something bigger than ourselves. And I recently read a lovely, lovely post by somebody whose work I really admire within the neurodivergent community, talking about their relationship with spirituality and talking about how for them, because they had experienced both trauma through the form of religion, and how that affected their spirituality, and how coming back to that was really soothing for them, really helped them regulate their nervous system, really helped them move forward. And I really resonated with that. That's very similar to my experience. And I'm hoping to actually get a survey out to the community to kind of get some insight into this. But I really feel like this sort of push-pull, wanting to be spiritual, wanting to have that connection with something greater than ourselves, and yet not wanting that because of past trauma, whether that is past trauma from the people within the religion or within the spiritual framework, or people outside of it that make us question the way we see the world. I really feel that push-pull is always going to impact our relationship with spirituality. And because of that, it is really gets at the heart of what it means to be AutiSpiritual or auto-religious. Because that push-pull really creates tension. It creates frustration. And for those of us who are AUDHD, we understand the frustration between the part of our mind that wants variety, that wants spontaneity, that wants impulsiveness, and the part of our mind that wants those comforting routines, that wants to focus on one thing at a time. And when you get that kind of tension within you, it's really important to understand that tension, to see where that tension is showing up, and then find ways to make that tension work for you. And when we do that, I think it allows us then to relax, to kind of step back from that fight or flight moment, to step back, to sink back into enacting our parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest, saying, hey, it's okay. It's okay. And I know that that's something that I have gone through really within this past decade. Just a little bit about my personal story. About in 2013 is when we arrived here on the homestead, and I arrived with really big ideas about what I wanted to do. And I hooked up with some people who I thought would help me do it. I thought we had real synergy, that our goals were aligned. And it turned out that that these people had a history of using people, that these people were acting very badly to it. But basically they spun me for about a decade. Even though our time together lasted less than a year, the seeds of doubt, the seeds of uncertainty, the stories that they planted into me about who I was and the way my brain worked, and that really kind of kept me spinning for about a decade. And it's only been very recently, within the last few years, that I've been able to sort those out and move forward with them. And in doing so, reconnect with my own spirituality. Because going from somebody who was a very spiritual person, I took great pride in being a new age girl. So, crystals and chakras and yoga and meditation and, chanting and circles and all that lovely stuff. And I was, next to a major metropolitan area where there was a community I could join into for that. I, went from that to basically wanting nothing to do with that. Well, that meant nothing to do with my published works, which I'm hoping to bring out, and eventually you'll see on the website here as I kind of go through them and update them, because they have been out a while, well over 10 years. Everything was published before 2013. So when you think about all of that, that kind of relationship is one that a lot of us have. And in some ways, I would argue even people who are not neurodivergent. But again, I like to talk to people who are anywhere on the Venn diagram of chronically ill, disabled, queer, or neurodivergent. And there's an and/or between any of those. Some of us are smack dab in the middle of that Venn diagram, and some of us aren't. And when that happens, I think anytime that you are outside of the mainstream without an established form for your spiritual outlet, for your community, then I feel like that I'm speaking to you in some ways, because that impacts your relationship with religion. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be AutiSpiritual. And I try to keep my podcast around 20, 30 minutes. So obviously in the time that we have left, which is about 15 and a half minutes, I'm not going to have enough time to dive into it deeply. And I also believe that while I may be discussing a very basic framework, there's a lot of work that can be done here. And there's a lot of work that we each can do to create our own unique stories, because Again, neurodivergence, whether you're talking about just one neurodivergence like autism or ADHD, whether somebody has a combination of neurodivergent brain patterns, then that's obviously it's all a spectrum, and it's not even a two-dimensional spectrum. It's a complete 360-degree spectrum that frankly probably transcends our laws of space-time physics, to where there are spectrums within spectrums and we don't even know the level of the spectrums. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not speaking for everybody. I'm speaking for myself. I would love your input on this. If there's something that you feel would be beneficial, I would love to open up conversations about this. This is the work of my heart. This is my purpose, is to explore this in many ways. So what does it mean to be AutiSpiritual? Well, first of all, just speaking from experience, being AUDHD, my brain moves fast. In fact, that's something that's commented on in my day job of doing tech support, is I can move 5 steps ahead of the customer and I have to slow down and, get back to the customer's level and then walk them to where we need to go. But my brain moves fast, and my brain makes connections between things. And again, I'm not talking about just me. This is something I hear from people in the community, that we make connections between two things that nobody would think to connect, but we see the common denominator. Well, when you start to think about spirituality, when you start to think about religions, when you start to study that, at least for me, it starts to get really fascinating really fast, because there's lots of different connections to be made and places to be explored. And one of the things I really like about the discipline of religious studies is that there's room for everybody. Now, I admit personally, I kind of overlap between religious studies and what my professors term as theology. I differ with them on that discussion sometimes, because theology is not something that I want to preach in the terms of preaching, but rather just making connections and seeing, okay, this goes here. And sometimes our brains will cross boundaries that other people feel need to not be crossed. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just, we defy categories, we defy labels in many ways. And so when you start to think about that, you may start to get like a syncretic, I don't think I said that correctly, syncretic religion, one that pulls in from many sources. That, maybe you have practices that resonated with you as a child that you really like. And so you may bring those into things that you do now. You may have practices that you do now that don't quite mesh with what you learned growing up, but you make it all work, and it works for you, and it's your own unique flavor of spirituality or your own unique flavor of a certain type of religion. And you may also be setting boundaries, again, thinking about the monotropism that comes with autism. You may have boundaries set to where you don't want to think about spirituality when you're doing yoga, for example. And there's a lot to unpack there, which I have within the Chicken Yogi show, which again, I'm going to get my Chicken Yogi stuff back up, so there's at least an archive. But there's different ways of looking at things, and basically being AutiSpiritual means that you're embracing the way that your brain works when you're thinking about religion or spirituality. What else does it mean to be AutiSpiritual? Well, one of the things that it really means, I believe, is that we need to recognize and understand how many major religions actually work to suppress authentic spiritual, embodied spiritual self. Now, again, not all of them. I got introduced to my work in embodiment and body theology through a subset of Christian liberation. But that being said, it's a very small subset. I was in and out of several different Christian denominations as a child, and I never learned about any of this as a child. And I never learned about any of this as a young adult, moving in and out of different religions. And so I don't want to say mainstream religions, but when the big name religions that come to mind when you think of religion or you think of organized religion, a lot of them are about conformity, a lot of them about adhering to rules, and they are rules without reason. And let me back that up a bit. They are rules to which you are not given the rationalization for. They have reason to them. For example, many of the dietary rules actually tied back into food safety back when they were created, because they didn't have things like refrigerators and meat thermometers and things that we do now. The rules are laid down like laws to where they are not to be transgressed. And so we think about them as like laws here in the country. And now, okay, I'm going to stop right now and say I am not advocating anybody breaking the law. I'm not advocating for anything illegal. But let's say you're driving to the store. The speed limit is 55. You got a song on the radio, you're listening to a podcast, your mind's wandering, you don't have the cruise control set, maybe you're going 60. They're not going to smite you for going 60. In fact, if you do get pulled over, you'll get a ticket. And the ticket has a financial fine to it. For people of color, obviously there are policing issues, justice issues that make getting pulled over much more dangerous. So I don't want to dismiss those. But whatever you experience isn't going to come from some sort of omnipotent deity that can see what you're doing, can see you speeding down the road, and cast a plague upon you for speeding down the road. For the most part, you can go across the parking lot without wearing your seatbelt without getting a ticket. And again, there's a lot to unpack there, and I don't want to diminish anybody's experience. When we think about being AutiSpiritual, getting away from the controlling religions and just allowing yourself to connect with something larger than yourself can lead you into humanist thinking. It can lead you into animist thinking, and can lead you into mystical thinking. You may find that you are drawn towards a nature-based religion, a pagan religion. You may find that you really like Buddhist beliefs, or you may think about Taoism. You may kind of, mix and match. There may be celebrations that you very much enjoy that could work for you, or you may take what works for you out of that religion you grew up with and discard all the rest. A good example of that is, I am not Christian. I don't describe myself as Christian. But I have to admit, this time of year, I'm recording this in the middle of December, I've got, and some of this is musically based and based on, my special interest and stuff, but I have a really soft spot in my heart for certain Christmas carols. Carol of the Bells is one. Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Different older Christmas carols that are sung in a different, that aren't quite so secular. Although, Jingle Bells, Batman Smells, it's all good. I don't mind the secular stuff, but I don't get into the holiday per se. The holidays are a rough time for me, but I do take pleasure and I do take joy in some of that music. And so I feel like you can take what works for you, and part of that being AutiSpiritual is taking what works for you and discarding the rest, following and accepting and understanding the way that your neurodivergent brain works. What it also means is allowing yourself to think beyond rigid definitions of religion and spirituality. An example I'm sure you've heard me give 100 times is looking up into the night sky and just feeling that connection and that awe with something bigger than yourself. Or living here on the homestead, I will never miss an opportunity to pause and watch the deer eating in the pasture or eating in the backyard or the front yard. I like to talk to the deer. Hey, you guys are safe. Thank you for allowing me to see you. To the point where I have neighbors that don't see them at all during hunting season because they know they're safe here. Likewise, I have that reciprocal relationship with other wildlife on the property. Snakes being one of them. No, I don't speak parcel tongue. But I have a black rat snake that likes to hang out in the feed shed because he gets a nice mice buffet there. And so I will open the door to get my feed and I'll be like, hey, I'm coming in to get feed. I'm not bothering you. Let me just get my feed and get out of here. That to me is a spiritual connection with nature, with other beings, with creatures that have just as much right as I do to share this planet and its resources. And that changes how I look at, my fellow humans. That changes how I look at my place in the universe. That changes everything that can be considered spiritual or religious, which again falls under that definition of being auto-religious or auto-spiritual. So I'm coming up almost to 30 minutes here, so I kind of want to wrap this up for today. But I just want to encourage you to step away from rigid rules and guidelines when it comes to religion, and instead think about how you can apply the same type of acceptance, the same type of fullness of your being and of yourself to your spirituality, and what that might mean for reclaiming yourself, for changing your stories, for that restoration we need to do with ourselves, and how a label like AutiSpiritual or AutiReligion really can change our perspective and change the way we think about spirituality and religion. I'm really curious to see what you guys think about this. So please don't hesitate to reach out, drop a comment, drop me an email at feathermaine.com/contact. There's a link there at the top of the website. Feel free to do that. I would love to hear from you. And I wish you well, and I wish you to be kind to yourself. Thank you. You're listening to Feathermaine Soul Wisdom, a podcast designed for people looking to live embodied lives and find their authentic selves. This show is hosted by Kit Kaelstow, body theologian and spiritual mentor. If you're looking to get in touch with your inner spirit, then this show is for you. Thanks for listening. And now, this week's show.